So, in his first day on the job as Secretary of State, Antony Blinken pledged to improve U.S. diplomacy around the world. Shortly after a welcome speech at the State Department, Blinken was officially sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris. He previously served as Deputy Secretary of State during the Obama administration and was approved for the top spot on Tuesday by the Senate. So for more on this, let us bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. Christina, so Secretary Blinken gave his first press briefing yesterday. Based on what we heard, what can you expect from the Biden administration when it comes to the U.S. on the international stage?
I think what they would call it is a return to normalcy. Now, you can argue whether that's accurate or not, but it's a return to multilateralism. You know, we've already seen the U.S. has rejoined the Paris Accord. The U.S. is back in the World Health Organization because the Trump administration's policy was kind of our way or the highway, right? America first. They were very upfront about that. Secretary Pompeo was very upfront about that, saying, look, this is what we want, and if you're not going to go along with us, then we're going to drive our own path. Whereas the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken have said over and over again, we need to rebuild these alliances because America alone is not as strong as America plus Europe or America plus North Africa or America plus any of our allies around the world. And our allies have been feeling really slighted by the last administration because so many of those decisions they were not consulted on before they were announced, often by Twitter. I mean, we've been in the room with foreign ministers when we've said, hey, did you know about this? And they were as surprised as we were. So they're hoping that it's not only a return to normalcy, but to make it things, I don't want to say boring because foreign policy, I'm a nerd, foreign policy is never boring, but maybe just a bit more predictable, a bit more measured. You know, one of the things he emphasized yesterday is they want to do the work on the front end, so that when they announce a policy, they've already troubleshot a lot of these things and it's ready to go and there's more support for it. Whereas in the last administration, a lot of times they would announce the policy and then kind of reverse engineer it and figure out how to do it. And he was asked yesterday, look, America has gone back on a lot of its treaties in the last 4 years. How can our allies, how can anyone trust the word of the American government when we sign a treaty and say we're going to do something? And his answer to that was by talking to our allies first, by doing the work on the front end, by consulting Congress, which was another complaint a lot of people had about, even Republican lawmakers had about the last administration. By doing all that first, we think we will build agreements that are more enduring and more likely to last even through a Republican administration that could follow.
That sounds very reasonable. The Biden administration is really just sort of days in. The administration has either paused several Trump-era foreign policies or put them under review. You know, there are some changes, though, that, you know, you can't do with the strike of a pen. And so I'm wondering, sort of give us a snapshot of what we're seeing so far, the changes that we're seeing so far, and the changes that have been perhaps projected, but may take a little more work.
So literally on the way out the door, I mean, some of these were on his very last day. Secretary Pompeo took a few pretty controversial actions that he hadn't taken his 2 years on the job. The top ones were he did this action for Taiwan that makes it easier and took away some of the restrictions that Americans deal with when talking about Taiwan. The reason they hadn't done that before is because it's likely to antagonize China, right? He put Cuba back on the terror list, which, okay, there's an argument that Cuba, the facts really haven't changed there. Cuba probably could have been on or couldn't have been on, depending on the way you argue it. But that kind of ties the hand of the next administration because even though you may want to do dealings with Cuba and go back to an Obama-era policy, you also don't really want to be in the position as they are now, if they want to delist it, of having to defend the human rights record of the Cuban government. The other thing he did was Pompeo declared that there was a genocide taking place in China, in Xinjiang province, against the Uyghurs. And Secretary Blinken has been asked multiple times if he stands by that, and he says, yes, he does. However, you have to wonder if that's something they really wanted to say, you know, their first or second week in office. They probably would have liked to have made their own choice on that designation. The choice was made for them. But yesterday he was asked by the Associated Press if there were any of those decisions that he's looking at undoing, and he said the one he's seriously reviewing was the fact that that Pompeo designated the Houthis in Yemen as a terrorist organization. And the problem with this is the conflict in Yemen is one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian crisis on the planet. And the Houthis, although they're bad guys, and you can argue whether or not they should be on that list, they control about 80% of the population centers. So by putting them on this list, this means that humanitarian groups, aid groups, they're not allowed to interact with them in the same ways, or they could face sanctions. So it makes getting food aid to a starving population incredibly difficult. It also makes it harder for them to negotiate with the Houthis, to try to negotiate a settlement, because even doing something like providing advice to them, it can be considered a violation of interacting with someone on the terror list. So Blinken said that is something he's looking at, because he wants to make sure all of our policies are promoting our end goals, which of course is to help people and end the war there.
The other thing that he had to say yesterday was that he wanted to restore America's image, particularly following the attack on the Capitol. I want to play some of what he said.
The world is watching us intently right now. They want to know if we can heal our nation. They want to see whether we will lead with the power of our example, if we'll put a premium on diplomacy with our allies and partners to meet the great challenges of our time, like the pandemic, climate change, the economic crisis, threats to democracies, fights for racial justice, and the danger to our security and global stability posed by our rivals and adversaries.
What role will Secretary of State Blinken play in this administration compared to his predecessor, Mike Pompeo?
I think they're both going to be prominent parts of the administration, but in very different ways, right? Mike Pompeo was the international face of President Trump. He was his closest cabinet official. He was the last survivor of all the people who rotated through that administration, and he adopted his same bravado, his same mechanism. You know, when he came in, he said he wanted to bring swagger back to the State Department. That's not Antony Blinken's style. He's very measured. He's very reserved. Even yesterday when we went into the briefing, you know, I did a bunch of briefings with Secretary Pompeo, and the air before he would come in, you know, staffers were tense, the camera guys were tense, the reporters were tense, because we never knew if he was going to ask us a question or tell us we're bad at grammar, which he once did to me. It's taking the temperature down a little bit. You know, Blinken is not a politician. He's spent his career doing things like this, so it's a different approach. It's a quieter approach, and I think he will be prominent, but I think it will be a less brash and more reserved and measured kind of approach to the Secretary of State job. He's also made a big emphasis that he does not think the State Department should be political, and he encouraged everyone yesterday in his remarks to remain nonpartisan, because that's how they can be the most effective going forward.
All right, Christina, thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Nice to see you.